Countries don't move fast for a planet themselves just because of moral obligation. They move fast for the planet when they think they might lose power. Right now, environmental movement mostly just argues that we should act on climate change because, oh, there's a moral obligation for us to protect our own planet. It's morally right. It's necessary for survival, and it's like our global responsibility that we should always take charge of. But like all of these points, they usually fail to like drive actually urgent government action immediately because firstly climate change like feels like a very distant global issue because like governments are delaying all of these environmental actions because the benefit seems like so long term and it's not even like targeted to this government. It's shared by everyone like the government and it's even like shared by communities outside of the government. Secondly, environmental policies are like loses in like a lot of the domestic politics. So like job security and economic growth are usually always prioritized over these climate commitments because all of these things seem more beneficial to the entire community more than just saving the planet in the long term. And thirdly, countries do not feel pressure to like build green all of these green industries, green actions very quickly because they don't have like the motivation to make these industrial changes because no one's actually promoting them to say that they have the incentive to give these to make these actions. Now moving on to our model on proposition. So on proposition, we're not changing all of these climate policies, but environmental actions should climate like policies should stay the same. But we are changing how these environmental movements promote themselves to the mass public. So what this will look like is made out of three things. Firstly, the environmental movements will focus on the point that having these environmental movements and changes will increase national strength and competitiveness and independence. So these people that promote these actions, instead of they saying that, oh, it's just a moral obligation to save the planet, instead they would say that if we don't switch to cleaner energy, we'll just become dependent on other countries for fuel and oil because we don't generate that much ourselves. So like the message instead becomes that like it's what if you have clean energy, you'll be more self-independent and you'll become a stronger country. However, if you're using fossil fuels, when you run out, you just become ultimately a weak country. Secondly, this will become the main way of running climate change and environmental movement in as it's talked about in social media and real life campaigns. So like people will constantly hear that rely on oil and gas will mean that there's going to be a bigger risk when they run out, and it's going to mean a big weakness in the national security. And secondly, if when you hear that they hear a lot about building green energy, it'll just basically mean that if you have a lot of self-dependent green energy, it'll mean more independence and national power. Lastly, governments will respond by treating climate policies as more of a competition for national security and power and strength. So this will lead to more urgent actions like funding uh, local green industries and technologies, putting like tariffs on other foreign unclean tech to protect the local jobs, and also like trying to get hold of important resources like lithium and like cobalt. So like climate change will become like something that countries do because not doing it will make them weaker than other countries and it'll put them at risk of security and dependence on others. Now moving on to my arguments. My argument is that countries will act faster when they think their power or independence and security is at risk. So the premise to this argument is that
You
governments
know why?
care more, no, governments care more about staying strong than about long-term global goals that's not directed at them. So if climate change is framed as if we work together, we'll just help the planet. But leaders can literally just delay it because like we have more important things in the like in our own countries that we need to solve before like focusing together to work on a global issue. So instead, it is framed as if we don't do this, we become more dependent and weak. So that's the way to make it more urgent. So in that way, governments will invest faster in clean energy and they will also stop relying on fossil fuels while they also become more secure and independent because they have a self-sufficient clean energy receiving method. For example, like in the Russian Ukraine war, like a lot of European countries realized that when like Russia cut off the resources, they have like a lack of gas and a lot of stuff. So they rush to like reduce dependence on Russia's gas because like when they depend on energy and Russia cut them off, like a lot of their citizens immediately became at risk. So that just proves my point that people need what is actually related to national security because when things get wrong, you need to have a self-sufficient energy development way that also supports global goals in the end. So if we do not do this, climate action will just stay slow and optional, and people, countries and citizens will always prioritize other things over it because there's always more urgent issues. So it becomes, and only when it becomes urgent is because policies will be backed by like real funding and fast decisions it's when governments are forced to see it as something that will cause insecurities within this national security system. My second argument is that people support climate action more when it is linked to their country's strength and their own benefits. Like the premise of this argument is that citizens don't support policies that feel like sacrifices just for a global goal or a distant cause, right? So like instead of like saying that we reduce emissions for future generations, the message should become like doing something for your own generation and helping yourself, like building green industry so our country doesn't depend on rivals. Like it should be like you should create local. It's creating local jobs in EVs and clean energy. People can see direct benefits in the job system, cheaper and more sustainable energy, and a stronger economy. So like without this, like climate policies will just be seen as like expensive, distant, and unpopular. And however, in our case, when we frame like these environmental actions as it is, with it, it will become something that people will actively support more and vote for because they think it's directly related to them. So because of these reasons, so proud to propose.
One. Madam Chair, imagine a world where people support renewable energy not because it protects the planet, but because it weakens a rival country. Imagine a world where governments invest in green technology not because it reduces emissions, but because it creates strategic advantages. Imagine a world where environmental movements stop asking what is best for the climate and instead ask what is the best for our geopolitical interests. That is the world proposition asks you to endorse today. At first glance, this may sound attractive. After all, geopolitical arguments are often politically effective. That they may persuade governments faster. They may attract media attention. They may generate short-term support. But environmental movements are not trying to win a news cycle. They are trying to solve one of the largest and longest-term challenges humanity has ever faced. Today, we will show you that heavily prioritizing geopolitical narratives fundamentally undermines that mission. So first, some rebuttals. So first, Prop says that citizens will care more about the climate when it's framed as like a national benefit. So geopoliticization creates broader support. But citizens care about the climate for many reasons. And they say that this is due to the fact that it harms their own benefit. But citizens know that climate change is an overarching issue that will harm themselves. Just look at social media. On social media, there's a lot of negative news about climate change. There's a ton of news about how climate change will harm us and about how climate change will disrupt the ecosystem, etc., etc. So citizens know that climate change will affect their lives a lot. This proves that national interest just the one that's guiding them to care about the climate. Taken.
Like when all of these stuff are like promoted and people do know that climate change is an issue, but they say they know it'll create impact. So most of them are saying that the impacts will be for a future generation, and a lot of people just take it as something you could do optionally when you have time. So it's not taken as the main thing to like for change.
Okay, so even if we accept the premise that citizens care about national interest more than the climate, let's be charitable here. So this premise still fails because citizens not just care about the climate for other reasons, but even if they did, due to national interest, their side doesn't support that either because as I'll explain later on in our speech, national interest often overrides what's truly good for the climate. Okay, so second rebuttal, they say that this actually allows helping the climate to be more efficient, and it will create good incentives. So a few responses here. Number one, geopolitics creates fragmented, duplicative investments, not like efficient acceleration. So in every country rushes to build its own domestic supply chains for like climate-friendly technology, like solar energy. They duplicate effort instead of like coordinating, and this wastes resources and slows global progress. For example, we can all agree that China is a country that was dominating like solar manufacturing, right? And the US and EU now now subside their own solar production to compete, even though this is like more expensive and less efficient than like global cooperation. So this example shows that this fragmentation means countries invest in less optimal technology just to be domestically independent, not because of the best climate solution. So Prague says geopolitics accelerates development, but if every country builds its own inferior tech instead of sharing the best, global decarbonization slows. That's how fast it's just wasteful duplication. Okay, so now onto a few definitions. So by environmental movements, we mean environmental organizations, activists, advocacy groups, and campaigns that seek to influence public opinion. And by geopoliticized narratives, we mean framing climate action primarily through national security, strategic competition, energy independence, economic rivalry, etc., rather than like environmental protection itself. So the key word in this motion is like heavily prioritized, because we're not arguing that environmental movements should never use geopolitical arguments. Sometimes those arguments can be useful, but our objection is that proposition wants geopolitical narratives to become the dominant framework through which environmental movements advocate for climate action. So judge environmental movements perform three crucial functions. That is to identify environmental problems, advocate for effective solutions, and build long-term public commitment. Success is therefore not measured by how many people can we convince, but it is measured by can we generate effective and lasting climate action. So this matters because climate change is fundamentally global, long-term, and dependent. And today today my arguments will prove that our side is superior. So first, geopolitics distorts the climate agenda. So environmental movements heavily prioritize geopolitical narratives. Environmental priorities becomes distorted by strategic interests. So first, environmental movements influence public discourse and policy agendas, right? If their primary message becomes, oh, go green because it strengthens our nation, then policymakers stop evaluating policies based on environmental effectiveness. Instead, they evaluate policies based on geopolitical utility. The question changed from which policy reduces emissions most effectively to which policy gives us the greatest strategic advantage. And sometimes the greatest strategic advantage is not the best for the environment, as we have proven in our examples. So, and these are often very different things. So governments may prioritize domestic industries because they create jobs or reduce dependence on foreign competitors. They may reject international partnerships because technology becomes viewed as a strategic asset. So Judge, I ask you, under this framework, are we really helping the environment, or are we just acting under misscoped intentions? So the stakeholders in this, so the first stakeholders, environmental movements themselves. So their mission becomes diluted, right? So instead of advocating for, not taken for environmental outcomes, they become advocates for national interests. This second stakeholders, like mainly policymakers, right? Because their incentives shift away from climate effectiveness towards political advantage. The third stakeholder is future generations. They bear the costs when environmental priorities are compromised. Judge, the purpose of environmental movement is environmental protection. Their primary message systematically pushes decision makers towards less environmentally effective choices, then the movement is failing at its core purpose. Okay, so I think the impacts in this point are mainly clear. It affects investment decisions, development, emissions, international cooperation, and much more. Small distortions today become enormous environmental losses tomorrow. Okay, so second argument, that is that geopolitical narratives crowd out the narratives that build lasting climate support. So heavy prioritization of geopolitical messaging prevents environmental movements from building genuine environmental commitment. So first, attention is finite. I think both sides can agree on that. And every message emphasizes another message neglected. So if environmental movements focus on national competition, and then they will spend less time discussing environmental stewardship, public health, and future generations. These are the narratives that create the durable support. Geopolitical narratives create conditional support. People support climate action because it helps our country rather than it helps our planet. The moment strategic interests change, support weakens because environmental values were never truly developed. So citizens develop weaker environmental commitments, and future environmental movements inherit a less environmentally conscious public. Okay, so even if we accept the premise that modern day climate action is ineffective, it is still better than the miscoped solution that proposition provides, because the purpose of climate change is to work together and as a whole and solve the issue, not go on a miscoped directions that compete with each other. We believe that is infinitely worse than our side. Proposition will likely tell you that geopolitical size narratives are more efficient, and even if we assume they are, efficiency is not the correct metric. The correct metric is how effective it is and how sustainable it is. Thus, we are extremely proud to oppose. Thank you.
Okay. The harsh truth is that the conventional way of using moral obligations and scientific fact is not effective and only supports minor global impact and actions. Heavily relying on geopoliticized narratives is the way to support the biggest international impact and to support substantial action. In the status quo, people using social media campaigns or other methods of raising awareness, it does not make that much of a difference. That is the hard truth of the current reality. You see people spreading awareness on social media, people doing the actual some people doing like in-person actions, but people behind the screens, people scrolling on social media. Harsh truth is that the majority of them just don't care because it doesn't matter for them. But when this becomes a competition between countries, when geopoliticized narratives actually provide incentives for people to strive for improvement, and that competition just emerges, that is actually the way that can support actual action and can advocate for actual green technologies and policies, and to advocate for substantial and impactful environmental movements. So the status quo has a current mix of believing that
You know what?
climate change, yes.
So how can you say that people will be incentivized when their national interests are harmed? When you have conceded that in modern day, even like people raising awareness about the entire world, the climate doesn't incentivize them to help. So
What I imply by people is mostly targeting government and companies. So first of all, for companies, when we have this narrative of like geopolitical narrative, we view the country as a whole rather than putting our main goal as working with other countries. So that means companies within the country internally, they're starting to work together. So that means technological advancement because these internal companies, they can actually share their technologies and new advancements. And second of all, for the governments, who's taking control is that the government can actually put their these policies and green technologies into actual action, because without like actual incentives, these policies and their all their regulations that they make are actually just have trivial to little or to no impact. So let me use an example to illustrate this. So, for example, the US and the EU, right? They just devised aggressive import taxes, and European Union specifically, they increased taxes on Chinese electric vehicles. So let's talk about the impacts of their action. The impacts of the action are effective, influencing, and definitely stronger than moral pleas than we have previously implemented. The geopolitical competition did what moral police failed to do and made wealthy nations treat green technology as a top tier national priority, because people in the US and the European Union, they actually started to improve their environmental sustainability and stuff. We see substantial improvement that the traditional ways of using moral obligations to cage people within the concept is not effective. We can see that it is ineffective compared to what our model suggests.
POI.
Yeah, yeah.
Oh, so if people right now they have a good potential of increasing all of those sustainabilities and stuff. However, when it goes on and on, should it be more country joining and then it could just turn into a completely space race?
I mean, let's be real. Sustainability has been going on for 50 years already. But do we see any big substantial impact? No. The answer is simple, because we need to change the status quo. Governments, if we implement our model, then the governments are now spending historical amounts of money on wind, solar, and battery factories because they view it as a competition. They view it as a race that they can't afford to lose. So previously, in the opposition's model, which is the status quo, governments will spend resources on other things because they don't prioritize this environmental sustainability as the first prioritization. So our model builds second of all, our model also builds a stable political consensus. What does that mean? This tackles the issue of climate change being a polarizing political issue within, particularly amongst Western countries. It means that in status quo, conservative political parties often reject green policies when they are framed as saving the planet or cutting back on economic growth. The benefit to this is that when green tech is being treated as a tool for national security and energy independence and bring factory jobs back home, it wins over voters and politicians who previously opposed environmental laws. It transforms clean energy, the idea of that, from a partisan issue to a matter of national defense and patriotism. This makes green policies having greater impact and driving actual social movements, and builds that internal consensus within countries, and to a large extent avoids the internal conflicts between partisans within a country internally. And also responding to the point that like actually opposition's point of saying that big countries no like big countries actually will only focus on themselves. So our point is that having allies doesn't mean you're not being independent. The point is that big countries know they can't survive alone, so they need alliances under our model. Because just being by yourself, it doesn't work because you need to find alliances. So, but
POI.
yes.
Doesn't this undermine global cooperation as now you have like different groups or like independent countries fighting over each other to see who has the best technology when if we work if we compare to like working together?
First of all, under your model of working together, it supports little to no impact in the current society. Second of all, I'll reiterate. So having allies doesn't mean you're not being independent. So our model is saying that countries, oh yes, you're focusing on your benefits first of all. That's first prioritization. You prioritize that, but it doesn't mean you can't find allies. So that's the part where it actually improves international really no. It can prove that it doesn't worsen international relationships because these countries use their resources and technology as bargaining chips with other countries around them. This actually improves or like supports the bond between countries as big countries know that they can't survive alone and it bonds countries together. So prop as outside, we think of green transition as national strength. You do this because if we don't do it, our country become weak, dependent, and vulnerable. And this narrative is competitive, state-centric, and fear-based. So you get policies like subsidies, yeah, subsidies, green sector, energy dependence tariffs, more patents, and secure critical minerals. The op narrative is that green transition is collective survival and climate justice. So you focus on human welfare, shared responsibility, and public good, and environmental justice. So you tell people pollution kills ordinary people, and climate change harms the poor first, and the worst. And the worst. This is a narrative of cooperation because you tell people no country can survive the country alone on our side. Importantly, your policy will be a lot more expansive and collaborative. So climate finance, disaster resilience, and tech transfer happens more, and more corporate accountability. Thus, for all these reasons, proud to propose. Thank you.
When cooperation becomes too much of a competition, it is not called beneficial. This is why we strongly disagree with the motion that this House believes that the environmental movements should heavily prioritize geopoliticalized narratives to advocate for greener technologies and policies. So, Judge, I'd like to first start on a rebuttal. So, the opposition will argues that without competition, countries will lack incentive and become over reliant on others. But competition distorts priorities. It encourages hoarding technologies, blocking transfers, and protecting domestic energies, all of which slow the global transition. Climate action should be driven by science and morality, not temporary geopolitical tensions. No country can solve climate change alone. We need shared technology, shared investment, and shared responsibility. The opposition asked us to compete. We ask you to cooperate because
No,
when it
I
comes to our there is no prize for winning. Reject it alone. Furthermore, the opposition claims that people do not prioritize the environment, ignores the overwhelming evidence to the contrary. Millions have marched for climate actions. Public support for renewable energy is at high, and young people around the world are demanding systematic change. The opposition offers us a shortcut that sacrifices the moral foundation of environmentalism. We offer a path that builds genuine, last supporting by appealing to what unites us, not what divides us. The opposition also argues that politicians reject green policies but pass war-related laws, so geopolitical narratives are necessary. But this proves our point. Politicians are already prioritizing geopolitics over the environment. Adding more political framing will not make them care about climate. It will simply reinforce their existing focus on conflict and competition, further leading to the moral and scientific case for environmental action. So let me quickly rebuild my teammate's case. So let me rebuild our position clearly. The opposition argues that geopolitical narratives are necessary because without them, climate action lacks impact, pointing to social media where the majority simply chooses not to care about environmental issues. But they misunderstand why people disengage. People don't care because such climate messages lack geopolitics, but because they feel powerless, overwhelmed, and that the issue is too distant from their daily lives. It has no connection with geopolitics. Adding geopolitical language does not solve this. It makes the issue even more abstract and disconnected. They talk about supply chains, trade wars, and national security, and these do not inspire ordinary people and confuses them. What actually builds long-lasting support is moral clarity, human stories, and a sense of shared responsibility. Narratives that make people feel empowered rather than powerless. The opposition offers engagement metrics. We offer lasting change. So I'd like to introduce a new argument about competition, geopolitical overemphasis competition, and undermines global cooperation. So when environmental movements adopt geopolitical narratives, they risk turning climate action into a competition between nations. And climate change is a global crisis that requires collective solutions. But geopolitical framing encourages countries to view each other as rivals rather than partners. Instead of working together to reduce emissions, share technology, and support developing nations, countries begin to focus on competing each other. Who can actually manufacture the most electric vehicles, who can dominate the solar panel market, who can secure the most critical minerals. And this competitive mindset undermines a very cooperation that is essential for an effective global response. So let me give you an example. So we have already seen this play out in the race of rare earth minerals, which are essential for producing batteries, solar panels, and wind turbines. So countries are aggressively competing to secure these resources, right? Often at the expense of environmental and human rights standards. Instead of collaborating on a sustainable extraction, recycling, and alternative materials, they are engaged in a frantic scramble that drives us cost, creates supply chains vulnerabilities, and leaves such developing nations locked out of the market. Similarly, trade dispute over green technology tariffs have slowed the adoption of renewable energy worldwide. The United States, the European Union, and China have all imposed tariffs on solar panels, electric vehicles, and other green technologies, claiming to protect their domestic industries. But the result has been slower development, higher costs, and reduced access for the countries that need green technology the most. This is not progress. This is protectionism dressed in such green language. Now, the proposition may argue that competition drives innovation, and to some extent, that is true. Competition can lower costs and accelerate technological breakthroughs, but innovation alone is not enough. We do not just need better batteries or cheaper solar panels. We need global systems of cooperation that ensure everyone can access these technologies. When countries compete rather than collaborate, they keep their innovations secret. They block technology transfers, and they impose trade barriers that slow the global transition. The green transition should not be a race where the only fastest win. It should be a project where everyone crosses the finish line together. If wealthy nations truly want to tackle climate change, they should be sharing technology, not owning it personally. They should be investing in renewable infrastructure in developing countries, not just
Yeah,
protecting their own factor basis. Yes?
just because like countries are like doing their own innovation, it does not mean like they're not sharing it with they're not sharing their progress. And also, when every country is doing making some progress, when it's combined, it should be like it should create a big impact to the entire global environment.
So, opponents, let me ask you, does competition mean sharing your own solutions or answers to your competitor? This will actually result to you in losing the competition. And is this what countries want? Definitely no. For competition, the definition of competition is to win by itself. Now on to my speech. So developing nations are told they need to industrialize, but they are denied to the technology and financial resources to do because wealthy nations see them as competitors rather than partners. Finally, let's consider what happens when competition becomes the dominant narrative. Countries start to justify environmental harmful policies in the name of national security. They expand fossil fuel extraction to reduce the dependence on foreign oil. Judge, clearly, as for such reasonings, we can clearly observe that if this policy is passed, the original meaning of reducing climate change has lost. People, governments use this framework as a tool to promote beneficial policies towards themselves. The original meaning slowly fades away. Judge, is this what we want? A negative result that has completely changed from the original meaning. Now let's quickly weigh the two sides. The opposition offers a geopolitical narrative that distract them from climate justify, and they justify harmful policy, and they turn a global crisis into a competition. They rely on fear, national self-interest, fragile motivators that shift with political changes, and that's why Project Propose. Thank you.
So let me start by pointing out what the opposition argued. They said that geopolitical narratives turn climate action into a competition that undermines cooperation. They argue that countries hoard technology, plot transfers, and impose trade barriers. They claim that moral narratives build lasting support while geopolitical narratives confuse and alienate people. So now let me point out a few problems. First, the status quo is already competitive. The opposition acts as if countries are currently cooperating. They're not. Countries already are hoarding technology. They're already protecting domestic industries. They're competing for resources. The opposition is just defending a status quo that is already defined by competition and self-interest. Our model does not create this hostility. It redirects existing competition toward a productive goal. Second, the status quo also have hostile relationships. Countries already hide technology from each other. They already impose tariffs. They compete for critical minerals. The opposition is just pretending that these geopolitical narratives would just create more hostility that does not already exist. That is not true. Hostility is already there. Our model just directs towards productive goal. Third, the opposition model does not support actual. He said we should cooperate, but cooperation have not happened. Countries have not shared technology. They have not coordinated on climate. They have delayed. The opposition is defending a strategy that has failed to produce the cooperation they claim to value. They're asking us to continue doing what has not worked. Fourth, the opposition reliance on moral arguments is not supported by evidence. They point to marches and public support, but public support has not translated into action. Emissions still keep rising. Governments keep delaying. The opposition is confusing awareness with action. People do care, but they sometimes just don't act. Geopolitical narratives creates this urgency that moral arguments cannot. Lastly, the opposition claims that geopolitical narratives confuse ordinary people, but people already understand national security, jobs, and competition. These are not abstract concepts. They are daily concerns. Supply chains, trade wars, and emergency independence, energy independence are concrete issues that affect people's lives. The opposition is arguing that people are too confused to understand these issues. So now let me move on to the core clashes. So first, we believe the first clash of this whole debate is about effectiveness of moral vs geopolitical narratives. The opposition argues that moral narratives are sufficient, but they have failed. Decades of activism have not produced enough action. Geopolitical arguments have worked. The EU's response to Ukraine war is proof. When climate action was framed as security, it actually happened. Change actually happened. When it was framed as morality, however, it did not. The opposition claims that geopolitical narrative confuse people, but people already understand national security and competition. Moral narrative have not inspired action because the issue feels too distant. And the second clash is on competition vs cooperation. The opposition argues that competition wastes resources, but cooperation has not happened, as we talked about before. When countries feel threatened, they invest. Competition just accelerates this transition. The opposition also claims that competition means countries will not share technologies, but the status quo already has countries not sharing. Our model does not create new secrecy. It just redirects existing competition towards green technology. When countries are powerful enough, they can ally and share with each other. The third clash is on moral purity and effective action. The opposition argues that geopolitical narratives compromise moral purity, but the planet does not care why you act. It only cares when that you act. The opposition would rather have a movement that feels good and then fails than a movement that succeeds. We choose the successive version. The opposition also claims that moral narratives build lasting support, but they have not built lasting action. Support has not translated into emissions reduction. The last clash is on the status quo vs our model. The opposition defends a status quo that is already selfish, already hostile, and already defined by competition. Our model does not create new hostility. It just directs existing competition towards a productive goal of saving our planet. The opposition cannot show that their world is better than ours. Let me move on to weighing the cases. Let's take a look at our best case. Our best case is where government treat climate action as national security. They invest heavily in green technology. Competition drives innovation and emissions will fall faster. The transition also accelerates because of this competition. People support these policies because they see job security and independence, and climate action becomes a national priority, not a distant moral obligation. The opposition's best case is where government continue to treat climate action as a moral choice. They delay action and emissions still rise. The moral purity of the movement is preserved, but its effectiveness is not. Our worst case is where some countries use geopolitical narratives to justify protectionist policies, but this still drives green investments. Competition still accelerates innovation. Even in our worst case, emissions still fall faster than the status quo. On the opposition's worst case, however, climate change continues unchecked because moral arguments were not enough. The planet passes irreversible tipping points. And now let me conclude why we win this whole debate. We win because opposition cannot defend the effectiveness of their strategies, and moral arguments have failed. We also win because geopolitical arguments have already proven their effectiveness, such as the EU's example. When climate action is framed as security action, it actually happens. We also win because opposition is defending a status quo that is already selfish, already hostile, and defined by competition. Our model does not create more competition and hostility. We are not saying that environmental movements should abandon their values. We are just saying that they should adopt the most effective strategies to achieve those values. Thank you.
Panel, what the proposition side is saying all the time that the EU example, how it's working, how between a bunch of countries is working right now. So let's take a closely look at the motion. The motion is that it should heavily prioritize geopoliticized narratives, which means that in our side, of course, there might be an incentive that countries will want to like improve sustainabilities and all stuff like that. However, in our side, we don't believe that competing with other countries is the morally correct solution or is actually correct, and because it will cause, in a long-term case, it will cause more harm than good. So now moving on to my first rebuttal. In the status quo, their solution never stand and never should stand because it is morally incorrect, as we said, and their rebuttal does not work. Why? Because we do not save the earth to outpace foreign nations. We act out a duty to vulnerable communities and future generations. They just believe that normal people like us, when we scroll through our phone, we don't really care. But when it comes to something political, people care. Actually, they don't. They will get more confused and they would think that these are like rivals between countries like us, that we're, for example, this is not the most sustainable way. And people might agree at first, but when governments actually put out these sustainable laws, and because multiple countries are joining all of these geopoliticized narratives, these countries might have vague laws or vague policies to support their sustainability. So then and then citizens won't even trust the government at all. Now moving on to my first clash, which is about which side is harmful for space, race, globe, and space is like creates a harmful space race, and a global, which side creates another better thing, which is global teamwork. So I believe that we don't have anything like that. We don't have anything that is like harmful space race, or we actually promote like global teamwork, because as the proposition said, is that they talk about countries competition and it pushes government to make more green rules faster. And why we say is that if we focus on like geopolitics, fighting climate change becomes just like a Cold War space war a race. Every country only wants to be other nations, not saving the planet together, which is what our human incentive is. We should save this planet together, not fight with other countries to perform vague laws. And I will explain in my second clash why we win this clash, because their geopolitical focus creates zero-sum race that destroys the global cooperations we truly need. And also there is morally flawed because it makes nations focus on beating rivals instead of helping poor communities hit the hardest by pollution. And okay, And then they also use this blame. Governments can use this blame to avoid their own climate duties. They can point fingers at virgin countries instead of fixing their own emissions. So that's why governments won't even make those good laws, or like the laws that seem sustainable to our opponents. And countries will hide green tech and refuse to help poorer nations, because sharing techs will make rivals stronger. So now, if we in our team's case, which is morally correct, we can share our tech, we can share our ideas, we can share our energies with other countries, and our systems to other countries, to make this whole world be more sustainable. And that is actually, I believe, this is the most important thing that we're achieving for in all of these sustainability topics. So now moving on to my second class, which is about how real sustainability is created. And I believe that our sides create this sustainabilities. So what our opponent is talking about is that geopolitical pressure forces countries to quickly build that tech, and they can pass strict environmental laws and people will care about it. However, no, because what we say that green projects become a competition like space race, and governments only make these showy policies for national pride. And why we win this clash also because with green projects become competition like space race, governments only make showy policies for national pride, not real environmental improvement. And what our opponent is always talking about, this EU example. However, this motion is focused on heavily prioritizing. So I believe that we should not prioritize this heavily at all, because since we have this thing that is going on, however, we can also share our own tech together. And sometimes if we really want a rival, we should not prioritize it, and we should not let a lot of countries join this. EU is an example, but it does not contribute to the motion howsoever. So, and also this shifts attention away from a real climate agenda. These countries will use these propaganda. They look eco-friendly, but they actually damage nature, and they do lower then they do lower sustainability goals, and they reach these goals actually slower because of all of these countries going on. They don't want to share their systems howsoever. So that's why I believe that these countries will actually not reach into the goal of sustainabilities. And let's see, in their side, they want to use these geopolitical things. And however, let's see what will happen to their side. These governments would use these blame to avoid their own climate problems. These governments they will have mindsets that they want to go against their rivals, and in order to reach this goal of sustainability, these countries would have this mindset that this world does not work together, and that's why they want to let these citizens also help them to improve their sustainabilities and all of these things like that, which can actually cause more environmental damage, and their mindset actually is just not correct, and we should not put this mindset into an action. I believe that if we think that we should heavily prioritize this now, we can never stop, because countries are joining these geopoliticalized narratives, and if they all join, people will get even more rivals, and it will cause actually backlash and all things like that. So that's why we believe that this is morally incorrect, and these countries will win backlash. And how our opponents are talking about how we say that people will get more confused, and in their case, people can join into these government things, and people would want to become more sustainable and help their government to become sustainable. However, it just makes people more confused. And in our team's case, our impact stands more on a long-term scale, because when countries join, these things can never stop howsoever, and there are less risks, and we give a united globe, and we also just want all of these countries to go in all of these countries to be rational, all of these countries to share the system, and get through their goals of real sustainability. So that's why, in conclusion, I strongly oppose the motion. Thank you.
Madam Chair, this debate was never about whether geopolitical narratives can persuade people. Of course they can. Fear persuades people, nationalism persuades people, competition persuades people. The question is whether environmental movements should heavily prioritize those narratives above environmental, health, and moral narratives that can currently sustain climate action. And proposition never explains why environmental movements should abandon what already works. Their entire case boils down to one word: efficiency. Josh, efficiency at doing what? Because throughout this debate, they confuse faster political mobilization with better climate outcomes. Those are not the same thing. But first, we say just some clarifications. Our side is arguing for the status quo, even though it's imperfect, and arguing for moral incentives when doing climate change. The status quo has a deficiency of such moral incentives because hostility still exists. Yet opposition is pushing us towards a world where hostility is further amplified. So first, let's grant a proposition their best case. Let's assume that geopoliticized narratives get governments moving faster. So what happens next? Governments stop asking what is best for the environment and start asking what is best for strategic interests. That is the fundamental problem in their world. Because environmental movements exist to push environmental goals, proposition transforms them into advocates for geopolitical goals. The result is distorted priorities. Politics are chosen because they help domestic industries create strategic leverage or advance national interests, not because they reduce emissions most effectively. Judge, climate change is not solved by passing the greatest number of policies. It is solved by passing the right policies. Okay, so even if we accept the premise that status quo is imperfect, it is still infinitely better than their side, which offers miscalculated solutions. We win this clash because they give you more climate politics while we give you more climate solutions. Outcomes matter more than activity. Again, even if in our worst case scenario, where all else fails, where it is really truly ineffective, it is still better than their side because countries only pursue strategic solutions for climate change because of their own interests. On the second clash, the world creates greenwashing on an industrial scale. The second thing proposition never answers is what happens when governments realize that environmental branding is politically useful. In our world, environmental movements ask, did emissions actually fail? In their world, environmental movements themselves have encouraged governments to judge policies through geopolitical lenses. Now politicians can justify almost anything as climate action. Subsidies become climate action. Trade restrictions become climate action. Industrial policy becomes climate action. Everything becomes climate action. Nothing is properly scrutinized. Judge, the most dangerous thing in climate politics is not inaction. It is the illusion of action because the illusion of progress prevents real progress. We win this clash because a failed policy can be replaced. A policy that convinces everyone it succeeded when it didn't is far more dangerous. That is exactly what the world proposition creates. Just look at the space race or any major competition in humanity's history. There's always been propaganda. And a policy that convinces everyone it succeeded when it didn't is far more dangerous. So final class, their entire model is built on temporary incentives. Now let's discuss some sustainability. This is where the debate is won. Why do people support climate action in proposition's role? Not because they care about climate change, not because they care about future generations, not because they care about environmental protection. They support it because it helps their country compete. That means support is conditional. The moment geopolitical incentives change, support changes. The moment rivalry weakens, urgency weakens. The moment national interests shift, environmental commitment shifts. The foundation of their movement is fundamentally unstable. Even in status quo, where proposition can talk all about how it's ineffective, at least the action, the incentive, no matter how small, for climate change is still there, and that is the morality of it, the preservation of the earth for our future generation. Remember this is status quo. People support climate action because their children breathe polluted air, their communities face floods, their energy bills matter. These motivations exist regardless of international politics. They survive elections, they survive alliances, they survive geopolitical change. Judge, in proposition's best case, more people support climate action and more governments pass climate policy. Even then they still get harms. They still distort priorities. They still create incentives for greenwashing. Judge, this debate comes down to one simple choice. We want you to remain environmental movements while they want environmental movements to become political marketers. For these reasons, opposition probably wins this debate. Thank you.
Okay, firstly, my call-outs. We can hardly see any substantial impact in the ops model. First of all, in the status quo, international relationships are usually weak. That is the status quo because countries aren't always willing to work with one another. And in the status quo, most countries aren't willing to share their own technological advancements. So they will have to justify why in their model there's that they claim a positive international cooperation or relationship. Second of all, the opposition hasn't proven why their side offers more social and global impact. They keep on mentioning but moral obligation. But moral obligation doesn't work because people will have that mindset of saying, oh, leave this to the next generation. This doesn't matter for me because I'm living my life and I have a well-sustained life. Because The status quo attempts to advocate for environmental protection, but witnesses trivial impact. So social media and campaigns are good, but with the mindset that most people have is this doesn't matter for me. Then when that mindset is the case for most people, then why would we expect to see large-scale civil movements in the status quo? Our model has substantial impact because, as I've used the example of US and EU before, this example illustrates how environmental sustainability has become a competition for governments instead of a moral obligation. The immediate impact is that they start putting in more resources on the environmental movements and the policies and regulations that they make. And that actually leads to substantial impact because we witness majority of the government's resources onto environmental sustainability, more on EVs, more on the sustainable development, and more on other things, other aspects of sustainability. Because we see companies working together for the benefit of the whole nation, and industrial workers, military strategists, and economists being mobilized under our model. Now moving on to the clashes. First of all, national pride vs moral obligation. Advocating for national security and power works better than moral obligations. Moral obligations doesn't actually awaken people. People are not being moved. They just have the mindset of this is not my problem. Only a minority of people will take action and take the initiative. Because using national security to advertise will spark and incentivize companies, partisans, and more citizens, since internal advancements are being valued more. And second clash, competition vs cooperation. The question is their model actually supporting cooperation in the status quo? No, because countries hide technology, they hide new advancements from other countries. They don't fully trust one another, and that is the problem in the status quo. That they fail to prove that we have a stable and connected international relationship in the status quo. And is our model actually promoting hostile competition? No, because in the end, big countries seek alliances from smaller countries and use technology as bargaining chips. It is always countries who have more power than others. So that's why we believe that independence and alliances are not mutually exclusive, which is what opposition mistakes. Countries eventually seek alliances because competition doesn't mean there will be no alliances at all. So in the end, we win on these two clashes because national pride overrides over moral obligation. Think about this. Do you see more impact if we keep on going on like status quo? We keep on using a moral obligation as a chain that cages people to the thought that it is our duty, it is your responsibility, which actually receives inactive reactions from most of the public. Morality and intention matters less when the ultimate outcome is more beneficial. So that is why I believe we have won this debate, because we have won on two clashes and we have proven the opposition does not have any substantial impacts on their status quo, and it did not prove why their status quo were case better than our model. For all these reasons, I believe we won.